Hey class, in this video I'm going to go in a little bit of detail of exposure equivalencies. So what is an exposure equivalency? An exposure equivalency is an image taken of the same exact scene and arriving at the same level of brightness but using a different set of exposure values. So once again, it's a picture of the same scene. The resulting image is the same level of brightness, but you use a different set of exposure values. One way to practice and understand exposure equivalencies is using what's called a camera simulator. So if you go to camerasim.com, the URL is also on this Canvas page, you will arrive at this page that looks like a viewfinder. And the scene that you're looking at is a playground with a little girl holding this sort of fan, this toy, this thing that she's holding. Um, and you could change the lighting on the upper right from sunny to partly cloudy, etc. And then the distance, how far she is from the camera, the focal length that you're using, if you want to zoom out or zoom in, and of course the camera mode. The first thing you should do is actually change this to manual. Make sure you are on M. Okay, and then you have your ISO slider here, aperture, shutter speed, and then your camera meter. This is very similar to some of your cameras. You will also have an ISO possibly when you look through your viewfinder, and a shutter speed and an f-stop. They're not all this laid out the same, but they should have this basic information somewhere in some particular order when you look through your viewfinder. Okay, so I'm going to make this lighting, maybe I'm going to make it overcast because it was overcast and raining today. And I'm going to make the distance, maybe I'll have her be at, I don't know, 2.3 meters away from the camera, away from me. And the focal length, maybe I'll choose 35 millimeter lens. Okay. I'm on manual, and then I think because it's overcast, I'm going to increase my ISO. Maybe I'm going to go, well, I'm going to go 800 ISO, make it that much more sensitive to light. Today it was really cloudy, and it was raining today. So if I were to photograph outside in the rain, I'd probably be at 800, maybe even higher, depending how much light there was or lack of light. Okay, and the aperture slider here, not all lenses will support, as wide open as 2.8. So keep that in mind. Okay, so right now I want to take a picture of this girl, a proper exposure. Okay, before we even get into an equivalency, you got to first take a picture that's properly exposed. Right now, the meter's blinking on the overexposed side. I can tell it's overexposed because it's a plus here and there's a minus on this side. It's blinking because it's actually off the meter. It's so overexposed that it can't even give me a reading. All right. So why is that? So let's take a look at what the exposure settings are. I'm at f7.1, okay, which is not very wide open. However, my shutter speed is 1/6 of a second. That's kind of a slow shutter speed. Okay. So that's the reason why it's so overexposed. So let me see. I'm going to move this to F8, and it sort of stopped blinking now. I think it's now 2 stops overexposed. Okay, that's what the 2 represents. I'm going to go ahead and move my shutter speed until it reads in the middle. The meter reads in the middle. So I'm at F8 at 1/25th of a second. Okay. That looks like it's going to be a properly exposed image because the meter is in the middle. I'll take a picture. And it's blurry, okay? That's because the shutter speed was kind of slow. It was 1/25th of a second. However, the level of brightness looks appropriate for this image. So I'm going to return to the viewfinder, okay? So this is a properly exposed image. Even though it was blurry, it was a properly exposed image because the level of brightness and the meter is at 0. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I want to make it a more shallow depth of field shot. So what that means is I want more things in the background to be blurrier than the things in the foreground. So in order to do that, you have to open up your lens. And when opening up your lens, the f-stop value is going to be a lower or smaller number. So from f8, I'm going to open up one full stop to 5.6. Okay. Notice when I move this aperture slider from f8 to 5.6, my meter is saying I'm now +1 overexposed. Right? Let's take a picture. Not only is it blurry because of movement, but it's too bright on her face. So that is an overexposed shot. So I'm going to return to the viewfinder. And it's overexposed because, remember, the previous shot at f8 was the proper exposure. Okay. So I'm going to go and change the shutter speed in order to take care of this overexposure. Now, you got to ask yourself, if it's too bright, how can I darken this image using the shutter? Do I slow the shutter down, or do I increase its speed? Remember, we want to make it darker now because it's too bright. So if you're thinking, well, maybe you have to increase the speed of the shutter, meaning the curtain opens and closes faster. That's true. So we want to make it a faster shutter speed. So what number would be a faster shutter speed? This is 1/25 of a second. The bottom number is going to change. Which number should this be? Should it be a higher number than 25, or should it be a smaller number than 25 in order to make the shutter faster? If you guessed a higher number, that is correct. So if I'm going to move my shutter speed to 1/30 of a second, notice that my meter moved slightly or closer to the middle. I'm going to go to 1/40 of a second, and eventually 1/50 of a second. I'm at 5.6 f-stop at 1/50 of a second, and the meter is at 0. So I'm going to take a picture. That looks good. She's not as blurry. 1/50 of a second is a faster shutter speed. But notice that this image is actually the same level of brightness as the first one that we took, even though it was blurry. Those two are equivalencies. Okay. Let's say I wanted to go even more shallower depth of field, meaning I wanted to blur out the background even more. That means opening up the lens even more. So from 5.6, I want to open it up to f4, one full stop. So from 5.6, I'm going to go to f4. Notice that the meter is starting to becomes overexposed. So I'll take a picture again. Just by changing the f-stop without doing anything else, I've let more light in, making the image, now it's too bright. Okay, remember the previous image, I was at 5.6 and at 1/50 of a second, and it was a good image, properly exposed. But all I did was open up my lens to f4. All of a sudden now it's overexposed because I didn't compensate for the shutter speed. And the meter also says it's overexposed by one stop. So again, we need to increase the speed of the shutter in order to bring this meter to the 0. It's overexposed now. It's going to be too bright, as you saw. How do we darken this? So increase the shutter speed from 1/50 to 1/100th of a second. Now the meter is at the 0. I'll take the picture, and that is a properly exposed image, and that is also an equivalency. We arrived at the same level of brightness of the same scene, but we used different exposure values. This time, it was at f4 at 1/100th of a second. Previous example was at 5.6 at 1/50th of a second. So let's say I wanted to even go the widest open that this lens can be. Not all lenses can go to 2.8, but this one can. So I'm going to go to 2.8. And again, I'm overexposed by one stop. If I take a picture, it's too bright. I have to compensate the shutter speed by darkening the image by using the shutter. Now I'm at 1/200th of a second. I take a picture. This is an equivalency again. Same level of brightness, but different values in the exposure settings. Let's review all those shots. Okay. The first shot, so we were at ISO 800. It was an overcast day. First shot was f8 at 1/25th of a second. It was blurry because of movement. It was too slow of a shutter speed. Slow shutter. Okay, but it was a properly exposed shot. All right. Then we opened up the aperture to f5.6, and when we metered, that's what was the exposure, 1/50th of a second. These are equivalencies. Same level of brightness on both shots, but notice they're different values. Okay, we opened up the lens even more, f4, right? We took a picture at f4 without changing the shutter, and it was too bright, it was overexposed, so we have to compensate for that, right? We had to increase the shutter speed, and that became 1/100th of a second. Then we went to f2.8, and again, we had to compensate with the shutter to increase the speed, to darken that image to make sure it was properly exposed, and then it was now 1/200th of a second. Okay, so keep in mind when I'm saying darkening the image, I'm not purposely making it underexposed. What I'm saying is that it was too dark when we opened up the lens. We had to compensate with the shutter to compensate that overexposure by darkening it, and therefore we were able to do that by increasing the shutter speed. So all of these values are equivalencies, right? They will allow you to arrive at the same level of brightness with each of these images. However, the subtle difference is that because you're shooting at different f-stops, some things in certain these images will be in sharp focus, and some will be blurred out more than others because of the f-stop. The wider open you have your lens, the blurrier or less things in focus will be in your shot. It's a shallower depth of field. As you increase your f-stop number, you're allowing your camera to capture more objects in focus in your scene. Okay, let's take another example. All right, let's say it's ISO 100. It's a bright, sunny day. Okay, right, and let's say you are at f11, and you end up at 1/200th of a second. That's a correct exposure. All right, let's assume that you metered, you took a picture, and it looks good. All right, now what if you wanted to go shallower depth of field? Okay, so you say f8. Okay, what would be, in theory, what would be the shutter speed here? Remember, this is the correct exposure. You want to open up your lens to get maybe a possibly blurrier shot in the background, or you want to decrease the depth of field. If you went to f8 and just shot the picture without changing the shutter, it would be overexposed. We went from f11 to f8. We open up the lens. Too much light is in there now. How do we darken it now to even it out, to bring it to a proper exposure? We got to do the same thing as the previous example. We have to increase the shutter speed. So what would be a faster shutter speed here? If you notice the math here, it kind of doubled up every time, right? From 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200. We're increasing it by one stop. So if that's the theory up here, what would be the shutter speed here? If you guess 400, then that is correct. 1/400th of a second. Okay. Let me throw a curveball at you here. What if you wanted to get more things in focus? Okay. F11 is great, but maybe you want to get as much of the objects in your scene as sharp as possible. So if you close down to f16, you're actually allowing your camera to capture more things in your scene and allow them to be sharp and focus. We just went from f11 to f16. From f11, we closed down to f16, so we're allowing less light in now. So if I were to take a picture here, it would be underexposed. So now we have to brighten the image for this particular situation. How do we do that with the shutter? Right? Well, if you look at the trend here, it was from 400 to 200, the shutter is slowing down, right? As we close down the lens, less light is coming in, it's darker. So now we got to brighten it up and compensate for that darkness there by slowing down the shutter. So the number, the bottom number should be a smaller number than 200. And if you look at the math here, now it's like half, right? Instead of double, it's now half. Half of 200 is 100. That would be the proper exposure. And again, all of these are equivalencies. Let's keep going. Let's say you want to maximize the depth of field. You want to try to get as much things in focus. Your lens, it supports f22. You get f22. What would be the shutter here? Remember, we got to slow the shutter down. Okay. Looking at the math, everything is now in half. So you go 1/50th of a second. Okay. So these are all, again, equivalencies. As you close your lens down, f8, f11, f16, right? You're closing it down. You're literally closing the opening of that lens down. It's getting darker. You have to allow more light in to compensate for that to get a proper exposure. So you start to slow your shutter down, right? Shutter is opening and closing. You start to slow it down to allow more light in through time in order to compensate and get a proper exposure. So you start to see the shutter is slowing down here as you close down your f-stop. Okay, so that is equivalency, and these are good things to practice. You can either go outside and use your camera and do that, or use a camera simulator. This is sort of theoretical, because you're assuming that you're starting off with a proper exposure. If that's the proper exposure, the light doesn't change, everything is constant, you didn't move anywhere, you're pointing your camera at the same exact scene. In theory, this would be the sequence of your equivalencies. And if you're not sure which way to go, if you're trying to do this out in the field, look at your camera meter, right? Or look at the camera simulator. It'll guide you that way. Just try to get the meter to the zero, and in theory, it will come up with the same value. Okay, so that is it for exposure equivalencies.